Hi, I'm Hannah, and welcome again to our podcast.
The question we often get asked as we go and speak at events, and some of you have asked us recently, is talk about the difference between coming from England to America. And the reason that's relevant for us is because we are from England originally.
Really?
I know some of you think we're Australian. No, we're not. But we feel as a family, the Lord called us here in 2007 as missionaries to the United States. So, Hannah, if you were going to start to answer that question, what are some of the key differences that you've noticed coming from England to the United States as our dog tries to get in the video down here?
Firstly, it's a much more dog-friendly culture.
It is a much more dog-friendly culture. Molly, our chocolate Labrador, is one of our best missionary devices.
Absolutely. The
Anyway,
dog.
so what else?
I would say one of the main reasons, or main things that is different about America is that you can positively be thought of as a Christian. So England is a very post-Christian culture. So I remember with our neighbours and friends, if somebody said, oh, what do you do? What does your husband do? Whatever, we would try and not tell them until they got to know us what we did. Because if it got in there too quickly, they'd go, oh, and it was the end of the conversation. Whereas if you started talking to them and engaging them, and they quite liked you, and then they found out that you were a church pastor or whatever, they would say, oh, really? I would never have guessed, but you seem so cool and so normal.
Yeah, so that's definitely true. And a thing that's all struck me is where we were in England for the last 7-8 years before we moved over here was a city called Sheffield, which is northern England. Kind of primarily blue-collar, post-industrial city, more like a Pittsburgh sort of environment. And one of the things that was the case there was that under 3% of the population would be in church on a Sunday morning. And in fact, the number's even gone down since then. So it is, to all intents and purposes, a completely post-Christian culture. So to say for instance, I started a soccer team when we were there. And there was a few guys from church, but mostly not churched. And so if I'd said to the guys, hey, why weren't you in church on a Sunday morning? That it wouldn't be on their radar. It wouldn't make any sense to them. It'd be like me saying to you watching, hey, why weren't you in the mosque on Friday? And you go, well, why do I go to a mosque? It's not even crossing your train of thought. And that's how it would be in other words. So in other words, what that meant was we had to learn to think and operate entirely differently in that culture.
Another difference that I've found is that America, I love Americans in that on the whole, it's a very much more positive can-do culture. So you run ideas by people. So I'm just thinking when we started our missional communities in Oklahoma and Ohio, and we said, hey, why don't we all gather together as families and we can eat together and just talk about Jesus, learn from Jesus. And even though they weren't all Christians, they're going, yeah, even if they weren't quite sure whether their husbands would be up for it, they just said, yeah, okay. Whereas in England, it would probably be not sure about that. And it just relates to so much stuff that America is a much more positive, up for it, can-do culture.
I think clearly one of the differences about the United States compared to the UK and Western Europe is that there is still more residual Christianity in the culture. So we lived in Oklahoma City when we first came here, very much Bible Belt environment, great learning experience for us. We loved it. Very, very different to Europe. I think that there's a blessing in that the country hasn't fallen as far away from Jesus, but there's also a flip side. There's a negative to that in that I think it's easier just to kind of toddle along as someone who's part of a church, so Christian, you're in a church culture, and you can kind of pretend almost or kid yourself that there isn't really a need to be on mission to your friends and neighbours because there's a lot of people in churches. And so I think the danger that can face the US is complacency, that we kind of think, well, this is all going to carry on as it is now into the decades to come. And one of the things that we sometimes say to people is, we come from your future. And so coming from your future and all the trends and all the demographics would suggest that, say, in a generation time, that the United States is going to look far more like Western Europe looks today. And you can see that already on the coasts, on the eastern and western seaboards. So I think there's a great blessing that the US has got, but there's a challenge with that, not to fall into complacency as well.
And yet the US is a much more pioneering culture. So yeah, it's got that juxtaposition, I guess, of it's comfortable with the old models of church, and yet you can get away with pioneering all these amazing things, and people think, yeah. Whereas again in England, people aren't as pioneering, and you've got to be careful. You've got that whole tall poppy syndrome thing, which is where if somebody does well in business or promotes himself or seems to be doing better than anybody else, they want to chop down that poppy and bring them down to everybody else's level. You can't outperform your peers, otherwise you will get pulled back down.
So it's a mixed picture. Like we said at the beginning, we feel called to the US. I suspect most of you watching are in the US. If you're outside the US, you'll be able to translate it to your context. But we love being here. We love America. We love Americans. We're US citizens as well now. So we got to vote in the last election. So thank you so much for that. That was a deep blessing. Quite the experience, last presidential election. Here would be a question for you to finish with, because we like to finish with a question to make you think. So if you are in the United States, you can answer it directly. If you're in another country, substitute your country's name in here. But our question would be, what are the top couple of things that you most love about being a Christian in the United States? Or your culture. And then secondly, the flip side of that, what would you say are the top couple of things that most concern you about being a Christian in the United States?
And I guess that could be at a micro level or a macro level.
Yeah.
So whether it's your country or whether it is your individual.
Yeah, little neighbourhood or town or whatever context where you are. So have a think about that, because it's important as missionaries, and you're missionaries like we're missionaries to our environments, that we have an awareness of both the strengths and the weaknesses of the places where we live.
Thank you for watching.